I never believed in ghosts, not until that night. And let me tell you, if I didn't live to tell you this story, no one would have believed me. I wouldn't have blamed them. It was late autumn when it happened. The days were getting shorter, the nights colder, and I had just moved into a small cabin nestled in the Appalachian Mountains. I was looking for peace, some solitude away from the rush of the city life, and it was exactly what I got. The cabin was old, but it had character, and the surrounding woods were beautiful. The sounds of nature were my company. I'd set out for this life to be quiet, simple, but I had no idea the mountains would offer me something far more sinister. I had settled in a little too comfortably in the first couple of weeks. The warmth of the wood stove in the mornings, the smell of pine and damp earth in the evenings, the way the moonlight filtered through the trees at night. It all felt like something out of a dream. But as much as I wanted to embrace the solitude, I couldn't shake this feeling. It wasn't quite dread, but it was something close, something that stuck to my bones, even on the warmest of days. It was on a crisp night in late October when it all started. I had been sitting by the fire reading a book when I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, like a low, distant whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, or perhaps an animal rustling in the underbrush outside. But it came again, this time louder, closer, and clearer. It sounded like a voice, low, guttural, like someone whispering just at the edge of hearing. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I had heard stories about the Appalachian Mountains, the people who lived here before, the strange disappearances, the whispered legends of things that didn't belong. My grandmother had warned me about the whistlers in the woods, the spirits who walked between worlds. But I had always thought it was just that, stories. I stood up and cautiously approached the window, my eyes straining to see through the glass, but the night outside was pitch black. The moon hung heavy in the sky, but the trees blocked any real view. Still, the whispers continued. Louder now. They seemed to echo, bouncing off the walls of the cabin. I thought maybe it was someone on the trail, a hiker, or a lost soul, though I couldn't understand why anyone would be out there in the dark like that. I grabbed the rifle I kept by the door and stepped outside, trying to steady my breath. The cold hit me like a slap, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. I called out, trying to make myself heard over the wind. Hello? Is someone out there? My voice sounded strange in the quiet of the mountains. No answer. The woods were still, save for the distant chirp of insects and the rustling of leaves. But that whisper, it had stopped. For a moment, everything was silent, and I thought maybe I was just imagining it. Maybe it was the wind after all. I turned to go back inside when I heard something else. A loud crack, like a tree branch snapping in half. It came from deeper in the woods, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I hesitated, my hand trembling on the door handle, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped farther out, scanning the trees with my eyes, waiting for something to show itself. That's when I saw it. A figure. A shadow, tall and thin, moving between the trees. It wasn't a man. The way it moved, it was wrong. Too fluid, like it wasn't walking, but drifting. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt the blood drain from my face. The shadow seemed to pause for a moment, as though it noticed me watching, then it vanished into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. I rushed back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. I could still feel my pulse pounding in my throat, my legs weak beneath me. The whispers started again, but now they sounded different, more urgent, like they were calling me, pleading. I couldn't understand the words, but I knew they were meant for me. I spent the rest of that night awake, staring at the door, rifle at my side, my mind racing. What had I seen? What had I heard? I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, some trick of the mind brought on by the isolation. But I knew what I saw, and whatever it wasn't human. The next day I did what any sensible person would do. I packed up and left. But the whispers followed me. They were faint at first, like they were carried on the wind, but they became louder as I walked further from the cabin. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just the wind, the trees, the mountains playing tricks on me. But as I made my way down the trail, I could have sworn I heard my name whispered between the trees. That was when I realized I was being followed. I ran back to my truck, my breath coming in sharp gasps. But when I reached it, I found something strange. The dirt on the hood was disturbed, scratches, deep gouges that weren't there the night before. as though something had clawed at it. And the windows, someone had written something on the glass, but the words were smeared, like they had been written in blood. I couldn't read it. I didn't want to. I drove out of the mountains as fast as I could, but even as I left, I could still feel the weight of those eyes on me. It felt like I was being followed, not by a person, but something else, something old, something that belonged to the mountain. When I got to town, I went straight to the local diner to get some answers. I sat at the counter, ordered coffee, and tried to keep my voice steady as I asked the waitress about the woods. She gave me a sideways glance, her expression tightening. "You've been up there, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. I nodded. "You're lucky you made it out alive." "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a chill creep over me. "The Appalachian Mountains. They're not just woods. There's things up there, old things. They don't take kindly to strangers. You might have disturbed something you shouldn't have." I looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" She leaned in closer, her face pale. "The whistlers. They're the spirits of those who never left. They wander the mountains, waiting for someone to hear them. And once they do, once they know you can hear them, they don't let you go. They follow, they call." I felt a lump form in my throat. "What happens to those who hear them?" "They're marked," she said softly, "and they never stop hearing the whispers. Eventually, they're drawn back to the mountain, and once they return, it's too late." I didn't sleep for days after that, my mind racing, my ears ringing with the whispers I could never escape. It was as if the mountains had claimed me, and no matter how far I went, they would always be there, watching, waiting. It's been weeks now, and the whispers are louder than ever. They've followed me home, into my dreams, into my thoughts. I hear them when I walk through the grocery store, when I'm at work, even in my own apartment. I've stopped looking in mirrors because every time I do, I see that shadow, tall, thin, drifting, just behind me. I don't know how much longer I can keep running from it, from them. I can feel the pull, the calling. One day I won't be able to resist. And when I do, I know the mountain will be waiting.
Next story.
I don't know what it is about the Appalachian Mountains. Maybe it's the thick forests, the fog that rolls down the hills like a blanket, or the isolation that's built into the land. Whatever it is, there's something about these mountains that's different. Something that you can't quite shake, no matter how much you try to tell yourself it's all in your head. But I know better now. I've seen things, felt things that I can't explain. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. Let me start at the beginning. It was a few years ago. I had just moved to the area, a little cabin on the outskirts of a town so small you wouldn't even see it on a map. I came here to escape, honestly. A broken marriage, a job I hated, and a life I didn't want to live anymore. So I packed up what little I had left and settled in this old cabin. It was a fixer-upper, but cheap, and that's all I needed. The woods surrounding it were dense, the kind that swallowed up sound and light, making the days feel darker than they should. The locals warned me about the area. "Be careful out there," they'd say. "Strange things happen in those hills." I'd smile and nod, chalking it up to local superstition. You know, the kind of stories people tell to keep newcomers on edge. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that. The first few weeks were peaceful enough. The sound of wind through the trees, the occasional rustle of animals moving through the brush. Things like that. But then it started. It was a Thursday night when I first noticed it. I had been working late, sorting through old boxes of stuff from my previous life. When I finally decided to call it a night, I shut down the lights and stretched. The silence outside was deafening, so thick I could almost feel it pressing in around the cabin. I figured it was just the mountains, the way they isolate you, but something in the air felt wrong. I stepped out onto the porch, cigarette in hand, to clear my head. That's when I saw it. A shape, standing near the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the porch light. At first I thought it was a person. Maybe someone who had wandered off the path, but then I realized it wasn't moving. Not even the slightest shift in position. I called out, thinking maybe it was a neighbor or someone lost in the woods. No answer. The figure just stood there, unmoving, silent. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to run inside and lock the door, but I told myself that wasn't an option. I wasn't going to let my mind get the best of me. So I slowly stepped off the porch, calling out again, Hey, are you okay? Still no answer. Just the figure, standing there like a shadow blending into the night. I took a step forward, and that's when it moved. Just a shift, a subtle tilt of its head. And in that moment, I saw it. Its eyes. Black, empty holes staring back at me. The cold that hit me was like nothing I'd ever felt before. It didn't make sense. I wasn't cold, not physically, but it was as if the sight of this thing, whatever it was, had sucked all the warmth from my body. I turned and ran back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath short and shallow. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, staring at the windows, waiting for something to move. But nothing did. The next day, I went into town, hoping to get some answers. Everyone there was kind enough, but when I asked about the figure in the woods, their faces went pale. They all knew what I was talking about, but none of them wanted to say it out loud. "Don't go out there after dark," one woman told me, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't want to know what's out there." I left the conversation feeling more unsettled than before. I couldn't help but wonder if I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The air had changed, the forest felt different, and the mountains, they were watching me. The days passed in a haze. I kept to myself, staying inside after the sun went down, but the nights grew worse. I began hearing things, whispers at first, just faint sounds, like wind through the trees, but too rhythmic, too deliberate to be natural. The whispers would come and go, always at night. I could never make out the words, but I could feel the presence of something, watching me. One evening, I decided to confront it. I couldn't live in fear forever, so I grabbed my flashlight and headed out into the woods. The air was heavy, thick with moisture, and every step seemed to echo in the silence. The trees pressed in close, their branches like skeletal arms reaching down to grab me. I didn't get far. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw it again, the figure. This time it was closer, standing just inside the tree line. But something was different. It wasn't still anymore. It moved, slow, jerky steps like a puppet being pulled along by invisible strings. Its eyes glowed faintly at first, but growing brighter as it approached. I froze, my heart slamming in my chest. Every instinct told me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. And then, just as it was about to reach me, it stopped. A voice, low and rasping, whispered my name. "Come closer." I didn't know how, but I could feel the force of the voice pulling me forward, like an unseen hand was reaching out and grabbing hold of me. It wasn't my own will that moved me. I took a step, then another, as if something outside of me was driving me toward it. But then, something snapped. I don't know what it was, but I felt it. A jolt, like a sudden, violent wake-up from a nightmare. The spell broke. I turned and ran. I ran faster than I ever thought I could, my legs burning, my chest heaving. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in, and I thought for sure that whatever was behind me was going to catch me. I didn't stop until I was back at the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The figure, the eyes, the whispers. That was the first time I truly believed in whatever haunted these mountains, but it wasn't the last. The thing, whatever it was, kept coming back. Every night, just beyond the light, always watching. It would whisper my name, beckon me closer, but I never went. Not again. Not again. The worst part, the last time I saw it, I couldn't move. I woke up one night as if something had dragged me from my sleep. My eyes were wide open, but I couldn't move a muscle. I tried to scream, tried to call for help, but nothing came out. I couldn't even blink. Then, in the corner of the room, I saw it again. The figure, standing in the shadows, its eyes glowing, its head tilted like it was studying me. The voice, its voice, came again, cold and mocking. "Now you know." That was the last thing I heard before everything went black. I woke up the next morning, lying in my bed, drenched in sweat. The sun was just starting to rise, and the room was empty, but I could feel it, deep in my bones. The thing was still out there, watching. I left that cabin the very next day, packed up everything I could carry, and drove away without a second thought. I don't know if it was the mountains themselves or something else, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting. Maybe it's the mountains, or maybe it's something older, something that's been lurking in the shadows for longer than anyone realizes. But whatever it is, I know it's real. and I'm never going back to those woods.
Next story.
I always thought I was too skeptical to fall for ghost stories. Growing up, I'd listen to tales from my grandparents, hearing about haunted houses, restless spirits, and eerie happenings, but I always dismissed them as nothing more than exaggerations or old folklore. But that was before I ended up in the Appalachian Mountains, where the line between the living and the dead isn't as clear as I thought. I moved to the small town of Mill Hollow a few months ago. It's a quiet, tucked away place surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills, and the locals are all friendly. The perfect escape, I thought, from the noise and bustle of city life. I'd rented a small, old farmhouse on the edge of town, a place that had been vacant for years. The owner told me the house had a history, but she didn't get into details. I should have asked more questions, but I was too eager to leave behind the chaos of my old life. The first few weeks were uneventful. The house was charming in a weathered, rustic sort of way. It had old wooden floors and the walls seemed to whisper when the wind blew through the cracks. I told myself it was just the age of the house, nothing sinister. But then things started to happen. At first, it was small. Objects would disappear. Nothing major, just things I wouldn't remember putting in a different spot. A cup that wasn't where I left it, keys that weren't on the table where I always put them. I shrugged it off. Maybe I was just forgetful. Maybe I was still adjusting to living in such an isolated place. Then the noises started. At night when I was trying to sleep, I'd hear the distinct sound of footsteps on the stairs, slow and heavy, like someone was walking up to my bedroom door. But when I'd get up to check, there'd be nothing there, just the empty, dark hallway. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. Old houses do that, don't they? But one night I couldn't sleep. It was past midnight, and I was lying in bed listening to the wind howl outside when I heard the footsteps again. Only this time, they were closer, right outside my door. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but the steps didn't stop. They were steady, deliberate, and then, just as I was about to call out, I heard something else. Whispers. Low, almost inaudible whispers, like someone was speaking just on the other side of the door. I leapt out of bed, my heart pounding, and threw open the door. The hallway was empty, just shadows and the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the windows. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I checked every room, convinced that someone was playing a prank on me. But there was nothing. The whispers didn't stop, though. They followed me, echoing through the house at all hours. Sometimes they would sound like voices in conversation, sometimes like murmurs, barely more than a soft rustle in the air, but always they were there. I started to lose track of time, caught in a loop of exhaustion and dread. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, and the worst part was, no matter how much I searched, I could never find the source. Then came the dreams. At first they were just strange, unsettling dreams, nothing I could really explain. But as the days passed, the dreams became more vivid, more real. I dreamt of walking through the woods near my house, though the trees looked different, twisted, almost alive. There were figures hidden in the shadows, figures that seemed to watch me, following my every move. And there was always a voice calling my name from the depths of the forest. One night, the dream changed. I was back in the woods, but this time I wasn't alone. There was a figure standing in front of me, cloaked in black, with eyes that glowed like coals in the dark. It didn't speak, just stared at me with an intensity that chilled me to my bones. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My feet were frozen in place. The figure stepped closer, and in its eyes I saw something terrible, something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. And then it whispered my name. But the voice wasn't just in the dream. It was in my head, like it was speaking directly to me. "Leave," it said. "Leave before it's too late." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The whispers were gone, replaced by the sounds of the house settling. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that I couldn't explain. The next morning, I decided to take a walk through the woods. I needed to clear my mind, to stop myself from spiraling into fear. I ventured deep into the forest behind the house, the trees towering above me like silent giants. The further I walked, the more the air seemed to thicken. It was a strange, heavy silence, like the world was holding its breath. And then I saw it. A clearing, hidden deep in the forest, with a single old tree standing in the center. The tree was massive, its bark gnarled and twisted, and it felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread just looking at it. As I stepped closer, I saw something at the base of the tree, an old weathered stone, half buried in the dirt. I knelt down to inspect it, and that's when I saw the markings. Symbols carved into the stone, symbols I didn't recognize but felt an eerie familiarity to. It was like I had seen them in my dreams. And then from behind me, I heard a voice. "Get away from it." I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the trees swaying in the breeze. But the voice, it wasn't in my head this time. It was real, and it was coming from somewhere close. I turned back to the stone, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing behind the tree, watching me. It was the same figure from my dreams, cloaked in black, with those glowing eyes, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I tried to move, to run, but my feet wouldn't cooperate. I was frozen, trapped by that gaze. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said, its voice like a rasping whisper. "This place is cursed, and you've awoken it." The ground beneath me seemed to shift, like the earth itself was moving, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. It wasn't real, I told myself. It couldn't be. But it felt so real. With every ounce of strength, I wrenched myself free and ran, not stopping until I was back at the cabin. I locked the door and bolted the windows, shaking uncontrollably. The whispers had returned louder than ever, echoing through the walls of the house. That night, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't even close my eyes. The figure, the stone, the whispers, they haunted me. I knew I had to leave, but every time I tried, it was like the house itself was keeping me there. The next morning I left the house. I packed my things and drove away, not looking back. I don't know what was in those woods, what I disturbed, but I'm sure of one thing: it wasn't meant for me. And I'm never going back to the Appalachian Mountains.
Next story.
I didn't believe in ghosts. Not at all. I had spent my life reading books, watching movies, and laughing at stories of haunted houses and restless spirits. In my mind, they were all the product of overactive imaginations, nothing more. That was until I stayed at the old Whitaker Mansion in the Appalachian Mountains. It was a weekend getaway, meant to help me recharge. I had been working too hard, running on fumes, and when I stumbled upon a listing for a bed and breakfast in the mountains, I decided it was time to take a break. The Whitaker Mansion was a grand, old house built at the turn of the century, and the listing promised stunning views of the valley and peace and quiet, something I desperately needed. When I arrived, the mansion looked more imposing than I had expected. It was huge, 4 stories tall with a steep tiled roof, and its dark wood and tall windows gave it a slightly eerie look, like it had been watching the land for years. I wasn't scared, but a sense of unease crept up my spine as I approached the front door. The hostess, a woman named Mrs. Whitaker, greeted me warmly. She was in her late 60s, with sharp features and bright eyes that seemed to glimmer with a knowledge I couldn't quite place. "Welcome to the Whitaker Mansion," she said, her voice smooth and welcoming. "I'm sure you'll enjoy your stay." I smiled politely, feeling the strange tension lift as I followed her inside. The interior of the house was just as grand as the exterior. The walls were lined with dark, heavy wood paneling, and large oil paintings of people I didn't recognize adorned the walls. The smell of aged wood and fresh flowers lingered in the air. Despite the old-fashioned charm, the house had an uncomfortable stillness, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something. After a long tour, Mrs. Whitaker showed me to my room. It was on the 3rd floor, in the back of the house, overlooking the woods. The room had high ceilings, a large 4-poster bed draped in deep velvet curtains, and a massive antique wardrobe. The window overlooked a dense, foggy forest that seemed to stretch endlessly. It was beautiful, but the view felt like it was trapping me, as if the trees were closing in. "Dinner is at 6, Mrs. Whitaker said, her voice softening as she watched me. "I'll see you then." That evening, after a long and quiet dinner with Mrs. Whitaker, I retired to my room. The mansion was still, too still, like the air had thickened. I found it difficult to shake the sensation that someone was watching me, but I tried to brush it off as nothing more than the odd atmosphere of the house. The first night, nothing happened. I slept soundly, although I did have a strange dream. In it, I was walking through the mansion's corridors, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. I was alone, but there was an eerie presence in the air. As I turned a corner, I saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway, a tall, shadowy figure with no clear face, just a vague outline. I awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, heart hammering in my chest. I shook my head, convinced it was just a dream, but the feeling lingered, like something was just out of sight, watching me. The second night, the house started showing its true nature. I was woken up by a soft noise, creaking floorboards. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the sound grew closer. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing down the hallway outside my room. My heart rate spiked as I listened, frozen in bed. I could hear someone moving just outside my door, pacing back and forth, the floorboards creaking under each step. I waited, too afraid to move, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the footsteps didn't stop. They went on for what felt like hours. It was like whoever, or whatever, was out there was waiting for something. Then, just as I was about to get up, there was a knock at my door. I jumped, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't answer. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice, low and muffled, as if it was coming from the other side of the door. "Help me." I couldn't move. I just lay there, staring at the door, my throat dry. The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. It sounded like Mrs. Whitaker, but something was wrong, too distorted, too unnatural. It wasn't a cry for help, it was a command, a whisper that felt like it was pulling at the very fabric of my sanity. Then the footsteps started again, retreating down the hallway, growing fainter and fainter until they disappeared completely. I lay there in silence, the weight of the moment sinking into my bones. My body screamed for me to get up, to leave the room, but I couldn't move. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted back to sleep. But I knew something had changed. Something wasn't right in that house. The next day, I decided to leave. But when I went to the front door to check out, Mrs. Whitaker was nowhere to be found. I searched the entire house, calling her name, but there was no answer. It was like she had vanished, leaving me alone in that sprawling mansion. I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. I tugged at the handle, but it was locked from the outside. Panic set in. I ran from room to room, trying every exit, every window, but it was all the same. Locked tight, as though the house itself had sealed me in. That's when I noticed something strange. The portraits on the walls. The people in the paintings all looked familiar. And as I looked closer, I realized that they were all staring directly at me. Their eyes, once lifeless in the frames, now seemed to follow me, moving subtly with each step I took. My blood ran cold. I backed away from the paintings, my breath quickening, and that's when I saw it. A new portrait, one I had never noticed before, hanging on the wall in the hallway. It was a painting of a man, pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with terror. The figure was shackled, and I could see fear in his expression, as if he knew what was coming. I backed away from the portrait, my legs trembling beneath me. And then I heard it again, a voice coming from somewhere deep within the house. Soft, distorted, but clear. "You should have never come." Suddenly I felt the presence around me. A cold, suffocating weight pressing down, wrapping around me like 1,000 hands. The house was alive, and it wasn't letting me go. The air felt thick with memories of people who had stayed here and never left. I could hear their whispers now, their cries, their pleas for help. And then the lights flickered, the shadows grew long, and the house groaned, like it was waking up. I was never meant to leave.
Next story.
I remember the first time I heard the stories about the Appalachian Mountains. I was young, just a kid, sitting around a campfire with my family, and my uncle started talking about the things that lived in those woods. He was one of those old-timers, the kind that had seen and heard things most people didn't believe in. We all thought he was just telling spooky tales, trying to scare the little ones, but he wasn't laughing. He wasn't joking. He told us to never wander too deep into the woods, especially after dark. We all rolled our eyes, but it stuck with me. It stuck in my head like a seed that wouldn't leave. Years passed, and I eventually ended up moving to the Appalachian region. I'd always wanted to live off the grid, away from people, away from noise. The peace of it was too tempting. So I found a cabin in the hills, tucked away in a remote area where you could hear nothing but the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. The cabin was small but comfortable. I was working from home, doing my own thing, and that first year was peaceful, almost too peaceful. There were no neighbors for miles, no distractions, nothing to remind me of the world I left behind. And at first, I thought it was perfect. But then came the nights. It started small, little things at first. Footsteps in the woods when I knew no one was near. A faint tapping on the window late at night. I'd chalk it up to animals, the wind, my own mind playing tricks on me. But the sounds kept coming, and they kept getting closer. One night, I woke up to the sound of something scratching at the door. At first, I thought it was just a raccoon or some other animal, but when I went to look, there was nothing there. No paw prints in the dirt, no sign of any creature. I figured I was just being paranoid. Then, one evening, I decided to take a walk. I needed some fresh air, and the sun was just beginning to set, casting a reddish glow over the trees. I had been in the cabin for days, and I thought it would be nice to stretch my legs. I didn't take a flashlight, just a quiet walk through the woods, feeling the cool evening air on my skin. The trees were dense, their branches heavy with moss, and the shadows seemed to stretch for miles. I didn't know the woods well, but I knew I didn't want to get lost. I kept walking, though, just following the trail that twisted through the thick underbrush. The sound of my footsteps seemed loud in the quiet, but something wasn't right. There was an unsettling silence. No birds, no insects. Just stillness. That's when I saw it. It was standing in the middle of the trail just ahead of me, hidden in the trees. At first, I thought it was a man, maybe someone who had been hiking, lost, or hurt. But then I realized the shape wasn't quite right. It was too still, too unnatural. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart racing. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with arms that hung too low to the ground, and its body was wrapped in something that looked like tattered, dark cloth. But the worst part wasn't the appearance, it was the eyes. They were glowing, pale and unblinking, fixed on me. No human eyes should ever look like that. I stood there, paralyzed, not knowing what to do. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it moved. Not walking, not running. It just glided, like it was floating. In an instant, it disappeared into the trees, vanishing without a trace. My pulse was thudding in my ears as I stumbled backward, turning around and rushing back the way I came. I didn't dare look back. That night, I locked myself in the cabin, every window and door secured. I couldn't sleep. The feeling of being watched, it was suffocating. The scratches at the door started again, louder this time, and I could hear them scraping against the wood, like fingernails on a chalkboard. I held my breath, my hand gripped tightly around the handle of the shotgun I kept by the door, but I didn't dare open it. The next morning, I told myself it was a dream, that I had imagined it all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was there in those woods, something old and dangerous. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore it, but the noises kept coming. They'd always come when the sun set, scratching, tapping, whispering, like something was trying to get inside. I tried to convince myself it was just the isolation, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the longer I stayed in that cabin, the more I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Then, one afternoon, I found something. I was out walking again, just trying to get some air. Not when I stumbled across a clearing deep in the woods. In the center of the clearing was a strange old tree. Its bark was cracked and twisted, almost like it was alive, and in the roots there was a small pile of rocks arranged in a circle. I bent down, curious, and saw something that made my blood run cold. A piece of cloth, dark and torn, was wedged between the rocks. It was the same cloth I'd seen on the figure in the woods. I didn't stay long after that. I left the clearing, heart pounding, feeling like the very air around me was thickening with something unseen. The whispers started again, faint at first, but growing louder. I ran back to the cabin, but this time it wasn't the woods that felt wrong, it was the cabin itself. It was like I was no longer alone there. Every shadow seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, pressing in, suffocating. And then, that night, it happened again. The figure. It was standing at the window, its glowing eyes staring in at me, as if it had been watching me for hours. I froze, unable to move. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. My throat was tight, like something was choking me. And then I heard its voice, low and raspy, like it had been waiting for this moment. Leave. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. And in that moment, I knew I had no choice but to go. I grabbed my things in a daze and left the cabin. I didn't care about anything except getting away. I didn't even bother to pack. I just ran. I've never gone back to those mountains. I don't care what's left behind. Whatever it is, whatever that thing was, it can have that place. There's something in those woods, something ancient and malevolent, something that wants you to see it, to know it's there. And once it's seen you, it doesn't let you go. If you're ever out in the Appalachians and you hear something scratching at your door, or if you see something watching you from the trees, don't stick around to find out what it is. Just run.
Next story.
It was the middle of winter when I moved into the cabin in the Appalachian Mountains. The kind of cabin that looks like it belongs in a postcard. Wooden, sturdy, with a stone chimney and a porch that overlooked miles of snow-covered trees. I had just gotten out of a bad relationship, and I figured the mountains would be the perfect place to clear my head. No distractions, no noise, just me and the wilderness. I had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone in the small town nearby warned me about the Haunted Hollow, a stretch of the woods just beyond the cabin, but I thought they were just tales, meant to keep people away. The locals were friendly, but there was always that underlying tension when they spoke about the woods. It wasn't just superstition, it was something else. I brushed it off. I didn't believe in ghosts. But there's a difference between knowing something logically and feeling it in your bones. The first few days were blissfully quiet, the kind of silence that only the mountains can offer. I spent my days hiking, taking photos of the frozen landscape, and reading by the fire at night. It was exactly what I needed. But then I started noticing things. It was subtle at first, little noises, footsteps outside when I was sure I was alone, a soft creaking sound coming from the attic, even though there was nothing up there. I told myself it was just the house settling, the wind moving through the trees. But then the dreams started. At first, they were ordinary dreams, the kind of dreams you forget by morning. But soon, they became vivid, strange, like I was watching something unfold from the outside. I would see a woman dressed in a dark, tattered gown, standing in the woods. Her hair was long and black, wild like she hadn't combed it in years. She would stand there, staring at me, and then she would start to walk. Slowly, her feet dragging through the snow as if she couldn't lift them properly. Every time I tried to get closer to her, the dream would fade, and I'd wake up with my heart pounding. I started to feel it, even when I wasn't asleep. That feeling of being watched, the strange unease that crept over me when I walked through the woods when I stayed too long outside after dark. And then, one evening, it all came crashing down. It was a cold night, the kind where you could see your breath in the air. I had just come back from a walk, my face red from the chill, when I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods. I thought it was a person at first, maybe a hiker or someone who had gotten lost, but then I noticed the way the figure was standing. Too still, too rigid. And then I saw her face. Her eyes were black, empty, hollow, like two pits of darkness, pulling in all the light around them. I froze, my body unable to move, my breath caught in my throat. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at me. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, locked in a silent exchange, and then without a word, she turned and walked into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. I don't know how I managed to get inside the cabin that night. My mind was reeling, my heart racing, and my hands shook as I locked every door and window. But the feeling didn't go away. That sense of being followed, of something watching from just beyond the reach of the light. I couldn't shake it. The next morning, I decided I had to know more. The townspeople were cagey, but after a bit of coaxing, one old man told me the story of the woman in the woods. Her name was Lila. She had lived in the cabin before me, years ago, but she wasn't like most people. Lila had a reputation for being different. Some said she had a gift. Others said she dabbled in things she shouldn't. But one thing was certain, she had vanished. No one knew how or why, but one night she disappeared without a trace, and no one ever saw her again. They say she's still out there, the man told me, his voice low, that she's still walking the woods, looking for something, or someone. The words sent a chill down my spine, and I asked the man what had happened to her. No one really knows, he said, but some folks swear they see her in the woods. at night, and some say she's still trying to find her way home. I didn't want to believe it. It sounded like a story spun from the threads of local superstition, the kind of thing people tell to explain the unexplainable. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with the woods, something ancient, something that had been there long before I arrived. I tried to stay away from the hollow. I avoided the woods, tried to distract myself with books, but it didn't help. The dreams became more vivid. In them, Lila would approach me, her hollow eyes locked on mine, and she would whisper something I couldn't understand. Sometimes she would point toward the forest, urging me to follow her, and every time I would wake up with a jolt, my body drenched in sweat. Then, one evening, when I was sitting by the fire, the door of the cabin creaked open. I hadn't heard anyone come inside, and I hadn't left the door unlocked, but there it was, slowly opening on its own, as if something or someone was pushing it. My heart pounded as I stood up, grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a heavy iron skillet. I crept toward the door, my pulse racing in my ears. When I reached it, I flung it open, half expecting to see someone standing there, someone who had somehow gotten inside. But there was nothing. Nothing except the snow, piled high, untouched, and an eerie silence that swallowed everything. I thought it was over. I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But as I turned to go back inside, I heard it. A voice. Soft. Whispering from just behind me. Help me. It was her. Lila. I spun around and there she was, standing in the doorway of the woods. Her face was pale, her hair matted with ice and snow, and her eyes, those eyes were still black. She didn't speak again, just stared at me, her eyes begging, pleading. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, but eventually I managed to move, to turn and run. I didn't stop until I was back inside the cabin, the door locked and bolted behind me. I never left the cabin again. The nights were longer now, darker. I could still hear her voice calling out to me from the trees, and I could feel her eyes watching from just beyond the window, always just out of reach. I think she wants me to follow her, to walk into the woods and never return. But I won't. Not yet. I still don't know if Lila is a ghost or if she's something worse. All I know is she's out there, and one day I might have to face her.
Next story.
I had always been fascinated by the Appalachian Mountains, but I never imagined that something so ancient, so wild could feel so alive, until I went on that hike. It started out like any other hiking trip. I'd planned it months in advance, an escape from the bustle of city life to the tranquility of the mountains. My friends and I had taken long hikes before, and this was going to be no different. But I was wrong. The moment we entered the forest, I felt it. The unmistakable sensation that I wasn't alone. It was subtle at first. At first, it was just the way the trees seemed to close in around us, how the air grew thicker as we walked deeper into the woods. I brushed it off. It was just nature doing its thing, right? That's what I told myself. Even as the wind picked up, rustling the leaves in odd patterns, like it was whispering to us. My friends didn't seem to notice, laughing and joking as we moved along the trail, but I felt that unease gnawing at me. We were about a day's hike in when things really started to change. The forest grew denser, the trees older, their trunks gnarled and twisted like something out of a nightmare. We came upon an old abandoned cabin, hidden deep in the woods. It wasn't on any of the maps, which only made it more curious. The cabin was falling apart, covered in moss and ivy, its windows long since shattered. There was an old rusted lantern on the porch, with the kind you'd use to light a dark path at night. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. My friends wanted to go inside, but I hesitated. Something about that cabin felt wrong. The air around it was colder, and the trees seemed to bend toward it, as if they were keeping watch. But we were all adventurous, young, and eager to explore, so we went in anyway. The door creaked when we pushed it open, and the smell of rot and decay hit us all at once. Inside, there was nothing but dust and cobwebs, and the only sound was our breath, heavy in the silence. My friends spread out, poking through the rotting furniture, laughing at the decay, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. That's when I found it, the thing that changed everything. It was a book, old and leather-bound, hidden under a floorboard in the far corner of the cabin. The cover was cracked and the pages were yellowed with age. The book seemed to hum in my hands, a low vibration I could feel all the way to my fingertips. It looked ancient, like something that had been here long before the cabin was built. I didn't know why, but I opened it. The pages were filled with strange symbols and drawings. I couldn't understand most of it, but there was one drawing that stood out. A figure, long and thin, its face hidden in shadow, its limbs long and spindly, like a twisted tree branch. There was a name written beneath it, in a script I didn't recognize. Suddenly, I heard a creak behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. My friends were still exploring the cabin, oblivious to the tension that was building in the air. I shouldn't have read it. I knew that now. The first thing I noticed was the sound. The wind had stopped. The birds had stopped singing. The world around us had gone eerily quiet, like we were standing at the edge of a void. And then it began. At first, it was just a low hum, something faint that I thought I could hear in the walls of the cabin. But then it grew louder, closer. I felt it in my chest, vibrating like a tuning fork. It felt wrong. Like something was calling to me. I tried to shut the book, but it wouldn't close. It was like the pages were stuck, clinging to each other with a force I couldn't fight. And then I felt it, something cold, like ice, running up my spine, crawling beneath my skin. I turned to my friends, but their faces were blank, their eyes wide, staring at nothing. They didn't move, didn't even blink. And then I heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from outside the cabin. Heavy, dragging steps, like something was crawling toward us. But it wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. The door burst open with a deafening bang, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't human. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched far beyond what should have been possible. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes, dark, cold, empty, like holes leading into nothing. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its fingers were long, far too long, ending in sharp, jagged nails. It crawled toward us on all fours, dragging its twisted body across the floor with unnatural speed. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It was like time had slowed to a crawl, like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape. The thing moved past me, ignoring me completely, its attention fixed on my friends. It reached out a hand, no, a claw, and touched the nearest one. His body went rigid, his mouth opening in a silent scream as his eyes rolled back into his head. And then, like that, he was gone. The thing didn't stop. It moved to the next friend, and then the next, touching each of them with its cold, gnarled hand. They didn't fight back, they didn't scream, they just disappeared. I was the last one left. The creature turned its head toward me, its eyes glowing now, like the light from the moon was trapped inside them. It didn't speak, didn't need to. It was as if it was telling me, showing me that I was the one it had come for. I was the one who had broken the barrier. I had woken it from whatever slumber it had been in for centuries. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, tearing through the woods, the sound of its dragging steps behind me growing louder with every passing second. The trees twisted in front of me like they were trying to keep me from escaping. But I kept going, stumbling over rocks, tripping over roots, my breath coming in short gasps. I don't know how I made it out of those woods alive. All I remember is running until I collapsed at the edge of the forest, gasping for air, my heart threatening to burst. When I finally looked up, the creature was gone, but I could still feel its presence, like something was waiting for me in the dark, just out of sight. I never went back into those woods. I still don't know what that thing was or what I had released by reading that cursed book, but I know one thing for sure. There are things in those mountains, ancient things, that should never be disturbed. And if you're ever out there and you find an old cabin, an old book with strange symbols written on the pages, don't open it. Just turn around and leave.
Next story.
I don't believe in the supernatural, or at least I didn't, until I moved to the Appalachian Mountains. It was supposed to be a fresh start. I had left behind a broken relationship, a dead-end job, and the stresses of city life to find peace and solitude in the hills. I rented a small cabin tucked away from the nearest town, and I was ready for a simple life. But the longer I stayed, the more I felt something was wrong. At first, it was just the feeling of being watched. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my skin crawling, convinced someone was standing just outside my window. But when I checked, there was never anyone there. I chalked it up to the isolation, the strange noises that come with living in the wilderness. Then the lights began flickering. I'd be sitting on the couch, reading a book or watching TV, and suddenly the lights would dim, then brighten again as if something was toying with them. I'd get up, check the bulbs, but they were fine. Just when I'd think I was imagining things, the flickering would start again, sometimes accompanied by the distinct sound of someone moving around downstairs when I was all alone. It wasn't just the house. One evening, I decided to go for a walk in the woods behind the cabin. The trees were thick and dense, and the air was heavy with moisture. As I wandered deeper into the forest, the silence began to press in on me. Not even the birds were chirping. The only sound was my own footsteps, crunching the leaves beneath my boots. Then I heard something else, a soft rustling from behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing. The trees were still, the path empty. I shrugged it off, thinking it was an animal or the wind. But then I heard it again, this time closer, and I could have sworn I saw something moving in the shadows between the trees, a figure that didn't quite belong. My heart raced, and I turned around to head back to the cabin, but the path looked different. It was like the trees had closed in around me, the way they stretched across the sky, blocking out the light. I couldn't remember the way back, couldn't find the cabin. I walked for what felt like hours, the shadows growing longer, the air colder. I tried not to panic, telling myself I was just lost. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. My thoughts kept racing, the paranoia creeping in as I felt the sensation of being followed, watched. I finally stumbled across the cabin, exhausted and shaken. I immediately locked the door and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. Every creak in the house, every shift of the wind outside made my heart race. I told myself I was being irrational, but the next day it got worse. I began hearing whispers, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. They weren't in any specific language, but they sounded like voices, as though someone was speaking just out of reach. I thought I was losing my mind. I checked the house. No one was there. No intruders. Nothing. I spoke to the locals at the town store, hoping they could offer some comfort or at least some reason for what was happening. That's when I first heard the legend. They told me about the old cabin I was renting. It had once belonged to a man named Elijah Blackwood, a hermit who lived alone in those very woods. He had been known to keep to himself, not bothering anyone, until one day he went missing. The authorities searched for days, but no one could find him. That was the end of it. People assumed he had wandered off into the wilderness and died, lost and alone. But the locals whispered that Elijah had never really left. They said his spirit still roamed the woods, watching over the cabin, waiting for someone to come back. The whispers I was hearing, the flickering lights, the feeling of being followed, it was all him. I laughed at first, dismissing it as some wild superstition, but as the days went on, I began to believe it. Things became more intense. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. Sometimes I could even make out my name. I'd wake up to find objects in my cabin moved, as though someone had been inside, searching through my things. The air would get thick with an unnatural cold, like a presence had settled around me. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront whatever it was. I went outside with nothing but a flashlight and my nerves. The moon was barely visible, but the trees seemed to stretch out in all directions, a dark sea of branches. I ventured into the woods, feeling like I was being pulled deeper and deeper. The whispers were louder now, a constant drone in the back of my mind, swirling around me. The trees seemed to press in, closing in on me, and the ground beneath me felt soft, like I was sinking with every step. I didn't know how far I had gone, but I was no longer sure where I was. And then I saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of a small clearing. It was tall, gaunt, dressed in old, tattered clothes, his face shadowed by the hood of his cloak. I could feel his eyes on me, though I couldn't see them clearly. He was just there. "Elijah," I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move, but then I heard it. The whisper. My name. It was unmistakable, a soft rasp in the wind. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, his voice gravelly like it hadn't been used in years. I froze, unable to speak. The words seemed to freeze me in place, and the air around me grew colder. I could feel the weight of the presence on my chest, like it was suffocating me. "You shouldn't have come," Elijah continued. "This place, it's not for the living." Before I could respond, the figure raised his hand and the ground beneath me cracked open as if the very earth was swallowing me whole. The darkness grew thick and I could feel myself being dragged down deeper and deeper as the whispers grew louder, more urgent. My limbs went numb and I couldn't breathe. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Elijah's hollow face staring down at me. When I woke up, I was back at the cabin, lying in bed. The sunlight was creeping through the window, and everything seemed normal, but I knew better. I could still hear the whispers, faint like they were just on the edge of my hearing, and every time I look out into the woods now, I can feel Elijah watching me.
Next story.
I didn't grow up in the mountains, but after everything that happened, I wonder if that was the one thing that could have saved me. You see, I moved to the Appalachian foothills to escape the noise, to find peace after a rough year. People told me I was running from my past, and maybe they were right. But it didn't matter to me. I just needed silence. My cabin was small, nestled deep in the trees, away from the nearest neighbor. The first week there, everything seemed perfect. The air was crisp, the view was breathtaking, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. But that calm was short-lived. The first thing that struck me as odd was the trail, an old, overgrown path that wound its way from behind the cabin, leading into the heart of the woods. It looked ancient, like no one had walked it in years. I asked around at the general store in town, and the elderly man behind the counter just stared at me for a moment when I brought it up. "Don't go down that trail," he said, his voice shaky. "It's not a path. It's not something you should mess with." I thought he was just being one of those locals who like to scare newcomers, so I laughed it off. What was the harm in a walk? But the warning stayed in the back of my mind. A couple of nights later, I couldn't sleep. The wind was howling outside, rattling the windows, and the trees were creaking in a way that sent a chill down my spine. So I did what I always did when I couldn't sleep. I went for a walk. I pulled on my boots, grabbed a flashlight, and set out into the darkness. The moment I stepped onto the old trail, a sense of unease washed over me. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the trees seemed to close in around me. I felt like I was being watched, like something was lurking just out of sight. The flashlight flickered as I walked, casting shadows that seemed to dance and twist in unnatural ways. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone, but the trail was getting steeper, and the woods felt darker, deeper. Then I heard it. Soft, faint, almost like a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then the whisper came again, closer this time. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned to look behind me, but there was nothing. No one. The trail was empty. I kept walking, hoping to shake off the feeling of dread, but the whispering followed me, echoing in the trees. It wasn't words I could understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was pleading, urgent, and strangely familiar, like something I had heard in a dream. That's when I saw it. At the end of the trail, where it split into two, stood a figure. A woman, dressed in a tattered white dress, her face obscured by long, dark hair. She was standing perfectly still, like a statue. I called out to her, my voice trembling, "Hey, are you lost?" She didn't move. I stepped closer, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "Are you all right?" I asked again, but there was no response, only the whispering, now louder, coming from her direction. It was then I realized I couldn't hear her breathing. No sound, nothing, just the whispers growing louder and louder until it felt like the trees themselves were screaming. Before I could back away, the woman turned her head slowly, her hair shifting like something alive. And when she looked at me, her eyes were hollow, black, empty sockets staring into me, like she was trying to pull something from inside my soul. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran as fast as I could, the whispering following me, wrapping itself around me like 1,000 cold hands. I don't know how I made it back to the cabin, but I did. And when I slammed the door shut behind me, the whispering stopped. I thought I was safe. The next day, I decided I was leaving. I packed up my things, ready to escape whatever nightmare I had just encountered, but when I tried to start my truck, it wouldn't turn over. It sputtered and coughed, then died. My phone had no signal, and the old truck was my only way out. I looked out toward the woods, and there, standing on the edge of the tree line, was the woman. Her figure was barely visible in the twilight, but I could feel her presence, like a shadow watching me from the darkness. I couldn't see her eyes, but I knew they were fixed on me. As the hours passed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I heard things in the woods, cracking branches, whispers, and faint footsteps. I felt like I wasn't alone, even when I was inside the cabin, even when I locked every door and every window. I stayed up all night, watching for any sign of movement. That's when I heard it again, her voice. This time it was louder, clearer, and I could understand the words, "Help me." The whisper was coming from inside the cabin. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, and there she was, standing just inside the doorway, her hair wet and hanging over her face, her skin pale and cold. Her hands were outstretched, reaching for me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare at her, frozen in fear. Her voice, now an echo in my head, kept repeating the same phrase, growing more frantic. "Help me. Please." Before I knew it, I was walking toward her, my legs moving against my will. My mind screamed for me to stop, but I couldn't. I reached out to touch her hand, but when my fingers brushed hers, a searing cold shot through me, and I was suddenly pulled into darkness. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, I was lying in the woods on that same cursed trail, the one I had been warned about. The woman was gone, but the whispers were still there. And this time, they weren't coming from the trees. They were coming from my own head. I never made it out of those woods. Not completely. Every time I think I've escaped, every time I try to leave, the woman finds me again. She's always just behind me, watching from the shadows. I can hear her whispering, calling to me, asking for help. I don't know what she wants, but I know one thing. I'll never get rid of her. She's a part of me now. And every night, when the wind howls through the trees, I hear her voice, "Help me."
Next story.
I've never believed in ghosts. At least, I didn't, until I spent a night in the Appalachian Mountains. I was just looking for a peaceful weekend getaway, an escape from the chaos of city life, and a chance to experience the beauty of nature. But what I found was far more than I ever bargained for. It all started when I decided to hike a trail that ran through some of the oldest and most remote parts of the mountains. The locals warned me about the area, whispering strange things about disappearances, ghost sightings, and unexplainable occurrences. But I wasn't one to buy into superstitions. I brushed it off and went ahead with my plans. The hike was peaceful enough at first. The birds were singing, the trees were lush, and the air smelled like pine. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, something in the atmosphere changed. The quiet of the forest became suffocating, like the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. I found a small, secluded spot by a creek and set up camp for the night. The fire crackled as I sat back, listening to the sounds of nature. But soon, I started hearing something that didn't belong. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching the leaves, coming from the woods around me. I froze, straining my ears. There was no one else around, at least that I knew of. I hadn't seen another hiker all day, and the nearest town was miles away. Yet the footsteps continued, getting closer, until I could hear them directly behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the darkening woods stretching out in all directions. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of the wind or an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The footsteps didn't stop. I could feel the presence of something, or someone, nearby, though I couldn't see it. My heart started pounding in my chest, my mind racing for explanations. The air around me grew colder, and I instinctively pulled my jacket tighter around myself. Then a voice. It was a whisper at first, so soft I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, clear as day. "You're not alone." I shot to my feet, my mind going blank. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the darkness around me, but there was nothing, not a single figure, no shadowy shapes, just the thick blackness of the forest at night. Then, without warning, the whisper came again, much closer this time. "You're not alone, and you'll never leave." I scrambled to grab my things and make a break for it, but my legs felt like lead. Something was pulling at me, holding me there, as if the forest itself had turned against me. My body was frozen, panic clawing at my insides, but I couldn't move. Suddenly, the air was thick with an oppressive, suffocating energy. The fire sputtered out, casting the area in complete darkness. The footsteps were back, faster now, running toward me. I could hear them just behind me getting closer with every passing second. I turned around and saw nothing, but I could feel the ground trembling as if something heavy was charging straight at me. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going. I couldn't see, couldn't think. All I could hear was the sound of those footsteps closing in on me. The trees seemed to shift, closing in like the walls of a maze, and the ground was uneven, forcing me to stumble over rocks and roots. I don't remember how long I ran, but eventually I found myself at the edge of a cliff. The only thing behind me was the pitch-black expanse of the forest, the sound of those steps growing louder and louder. I was trapped. I turned to face the cliff, my heart racing in my chest, when I noticed something else. Standing on the other side of the clearing, just beyond the tree line, was a figure. It was tall and hunched, like it was made of the very shadows of the forest. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stared at me with hollow, empty eyes. I couldn't breathe. It was like the world around me was closing in, and there was nowhere to go. My legs gave out from beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself. And then I heard it. The whisper again, so close I could feel the chill of its breath on my neck. "You'll never leave." The darkness around me seemed to warp and twist, and for a moment I felt like I was being pulled into the earth itself. But then, just as quickly, the pressure vanished. The air felt lighter, the footsteps stopped, and the figure in the distance was gone. I didn't stick around to find out what happened next. I didn't care if I was going crazy or if it was just my imagination running wild. I turned and ran, straight down the mountain, not stopping until I reached my car. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't bring myself to even close my eyes. The next day, I tried to tell the locals what had happened, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. I asked about the area I had hiked through, and that was when the stories came pouring out. They told me about the old spirits of the mountain, the ones who had never left. They said that the land was cursed, that it had been the site of countless disappearances over the years. They spoke of strange figures, of dark shadows that walked the earth, of voices that could be heard on the wind. I didn't know what to think. Was I just caught in some bizarre, unexplainable event? Or was there something more sinister at work? All I knew was that I would never return to the Appalachian Mountains. And I would never forget the feeling of being hunted, of being watched by something that wasn't quite human. Some nights, I still hear those footsteps. I hear the whisper in the dark, and I can't shake the feeling that the thing in the woods is still out there, waiting for me to come back. And if I ever do, it'll be the last time I ever walk the earth.
Next story.
I've never been one to believe in the supernatural, but I've learned in the hardest way possible that some things can't be explained by logic alone. It was the middle of spring when I made the decision to hike the Appalachian Trail. I had heard all the stories, legends from the locals about strange occurrences, mysterious lights in the woods, and travelers who disappeared without a trace, but I never thought much of them. They were just stories. I set out alone, eager for an adventure, ready to prove that I could handle the wild on my own. The first few days were beautiful. The forest was alive, the air crisp, and the views breathtaking. I met a few hikers along the way, shared stories around the campfire, but for the most part, I was content with the solitude. Then, about 5 days in, I arrived at a secluded campsite by a small creek. The map didn't mention it, but there was a small clearing with a flat spot for a tent. It felt like a good place to rest for the night, far away from the trailhead and the last town I'd passed through. The fire was crackling by sunset, and I settled in with my dinner, feeling the weight of the solitude around me. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. The first sound I heard was a faint rustling in the trees. I assumed it was just a deer or some small animal moving through the underbrush, but when I listened harder, I could swear it sounded like footsteps. Soft, but deliberate. I stood up, my heart thudding in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, half expecting a fellow hiker to appear from the woods. No answer. I shrugged it off and went back to my campfire, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. But then the footsteps came again, closer this time. They weren't the random sounds of an animal. They were too rhythmic, too human. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing. I scanned the perimeter, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A cold wind swept through the clearing, and the rustling stopped. I told myself it was just the wind, but then came the whisper. A voice, soft like a breeze just at the edge of hearing. Get out! It was barely audible, but I heard it clear as day. I froze, my stomach sinking. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, the isolation getting to me. But the voice didn't stop. It came again, this time louder, more insistent. Get out! My pulse raced. This wasn't normal. I wasn't alone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I reached for my backpack, grabbed my survival knife, and backed up toward the fire. I should have packed up and left, but I was too scared to move. I just stood there, listening, waiting. Then the footsteps came again, but this time they weren't alone. I could hear more. Dozens of footsteps, coming from all directions. They weren't approaching me, they were circling me. I could hear the crunching of leaves and twigs underfoot, closing in like a group of people stepping slowly toward me. I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction. But there was nothing. The clearing was empty. The trees were still. My breath came in ragged gasps. Who's out there? I shouted, my voice trembling. Show yourself. There was no answer, just the deafening silence that followed. And then I saw it, a figure, tall and thin, standing just at the edge of the woods. Its face was obscured by a dark hood, but its body was unnaturally still. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me from the darkness. I felt my legs shake, my throat dry. I wanted to run, but some force, kept me rooted to the spot. I could feel the weight of its gaze on me as if it were watching my every move. I tried to call out again, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure didn't move. But the whispering returned. You shouldn't have come, it said, this time much clearer. You don't belong here. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I realized I had made a terrible mistake coming here. The stories, the warnings, they weren't just stories, they were real. The figure took a step forward, and I felt a cold gust of wind. My feet finally moved, and I turned to flee, my body propelled by pure panic. I ran toward the trail, my flashlight bobbing in the dark as I tried to find my bearings. The footsteps were behind me, getting closer, but every time I looked back, there was nothing. Nothing. But the trees and the shadows. I ran for what felt like hours, my legs burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, that it was watching me. I stumbled and fell twice, scraping my knees on the rough terrain, but I couldn't stop. I needed to get out of those woods. I needed to escape. Eventually, I found my way back to the main trail. My heart was still racing and my hands were shaking, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept moving, telling myself I was almost there, that I was almost safe. The sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn, but I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot at the trailhead. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and drove away, not stopping until I was hours outside of the mountains. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me, that the woods are still watching me. The whispers never really stopped. They follow me in my dreams now. Those same words, you don't belong here. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was exhaustion or the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But I'll never go back to the Appalachian Trail. I'll never set foot near that spot again. Some things are meant to be left alone, and those woods, they were never meant to be explored.